to our online course about freelancing, brought with the very talented and debonair Benjamin Law. So great, you found us, and you're working well and truly into the evening, as every good freelancer does. So thank you for joining us. I'm here in Sydney, as is Ben. But if you can probably see on the right-hand side here, there's lots of people, like Marissa's in Brisbane, Vegas, Karen's in far North Queensland. Let us know where you're from, so we can have a bit of a chat. So yeah, this is the third in our series of free webinars. The first was with Patrick Lenton on social media, and the second was with Alison Croggan on grant writing. And they're all free. Thank you thanks to the Copyright Agency Limited, who have very generously funded this opportunity for you to see this for free and get wonderful people like Ben to talk to us. And they are also available forever on the Writer's Block website. And so if you've missed the presentation, you can go through our website and see a replay of that. So a couple of housekeeping things. You've probably seen on the inside there is a chat room. Ask questions there. I'm going to say goodbye to take over, but I'm still going to be moderating, and you can. I'll highlight questions for Ben to answer at the end. He's probably going to talk for about 40 minutes with a presentation, with plenty of time for Q&A at the end. And so I'll add the best ones to the top there. But you can also chat directly to each other. So if someone says something really interesting, you can just click on their name and respond to that using the app button. Pardon me. And if you're having problems with the video, it might be a good idea to change the resolution. So you can do that in the bottom right-hand corner as well, high resolution video might drain your bandwidth. So yeah, let us know where you're from. If you have any questions at any stage, please ask and we'll get to them. But I think without further ado, I'm going to throw over to Ben. Benjamin Law is a Sydney-based TV screenwriter, journalist, and newspaper columnist who has a PhD in creative writing. He's the author of 2 books, The Family Law Engager, and he's had his work translated into various languages as well as television for the screen. So if you've been paying attention to SBS recently, you'll see how well that the Family Law memoir has been turned into a TV show. And he's also a frequent contributor to The Good Weekend for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, as well as Frankie and The Monthly, and he's busily working on a quarterly essay right now, which you may talk about. So yeah, we hope you enjoy it, and please get involved with the discussion.
Hey everyone, how are you going? Thank you so much for tuning in from wherever you are. If you're in Australia, 8 o'clock at the moment. Special shout out to fellow Queenslanders, even though I'm currently based in Sydney at the moment. But I also see there are people from France, South Africa, USA tuning in. So hello world, thanks for making the time. As Jeff explained, I am a Sydney-based writer, and I'll just give a little bit of an introduction to myself. Don't freak out, I'm going to switch to PowerPoint mode so you guys can see a little bit about what I'm talking about, and you don't need to look at my disheveled bookshelf behind me. Hello, James from Adelaide. Hello, Jesse in Sydney. Okay, just hold on. Now and hear my disembodied voice. So we're going to be talking about the basics of freelancing today. Usually when I give this workshop, it's over 8 hours. You are getting the far more condensed version of what I usually talk about. What we're really going to hone in on tonight is how to get ideas, how to pitch those ideas to editors, and how to basically manage money and time. So it really is about the kind of business side of things. When I run this workshop in other times, when we've got more time, and later on at Writer's Block, we're probably going to do a much more involved version of this. So keep your eyes out on the website and the email list for details. But when I do the longer version, we do stuff like craft, how to interview people, how to research those stories. We're not really going to cover that tonight. It's more about business and getting work in the first place. Okay, so as you heard a little bit about myself, I come from the world of magazine writing. So when I was a teenager, I was writing for Street Press. Eventually, I started writing for glossies like Frankie Magazine, the monthly magazine, and nowadays I have a weekly column in Good Weekend Magazine where I sometimes do long-form journalism as well. And I also write books. So my first book, The Family Law, which was a black comedy memoir about my family. My last name's Law. Yes, it's a very clever play on words, obviously. Has had a few editions out, and now it's a TV series. So I have a screenwriting background as well. And I do long-form journalism, as was represented in my second book, Geisha. So if you guys have any questions about that sort of stuff, about the publishing industry as well, about how to get an agent, it's not something that I'm particularly going to be focused on, but do ask questions if you have them. Jeff will pick out all the questions at the end, and we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A afterwards. But let's get straight into it. So what are we going to be covering tonight? I want to be talking about ideas, where to get them from. That sounds very remedial. It sounds a little bit hippie-ish. Where do we get inspiration and ideas from? But I want to give you some practical tips about how to generate ideas and how to pitch them to editors, which we'll talk about in depth as well. How to approach editors and what does a good pitch look like. I want to talk about invoicing as well, and I want to talk a bit about time management, and we'll get to Q&A at the end. So when I scroll through, I see all of your questions coming up now. I will get to all of those questions in a big chunk far at the end, but ask them as we go along. That's completely fine. Okay, so let's talk about ideas. You know that you want to write for magazines. You've got a very, very good idea for a website, but at the same time, you really, if you are going to be a freelancer, surviving on this for a living or making decent income from it, you need to be a bit of an ideas factory. I'm just going to give a few case studies for some previous stories that I've written, 4,000 word feature stories that I've written and where those ideas came from. This was a piece that I wrote for Good Weekend about the vaccination debates. There is a big anti-vaccine movement in Australia that believes that vaccines cause autism, etc. And I always thought that these people were kind of, strange in their own way and must have been a small minority of people, until I went to a dinner party and I realized that one of my friends thought, actually, I'm a parent of a child and I think children are over-vaccinated as well. And that made me think, wow, that really is not a niche issue when educated people also have reservations about vaccines. And I'm not a parent myself, I'm not a medical professional, but from that dinner party conversation, I thought that's a really interesting issue to wrestle with. And so I started doing the research and turned it into a story for Good Weekend. So first place to get ideas, conversations. If there is an argument that you're having with friends, if there's a dinner party topic that comes up, and there is a question that you cannot answer, a good place to answer it often is in a feature story. This was another story that I wrote for Q Weekend, which is a News Limited publication in Queensland that comes out with the Courier Mail. It used to be a coloured glossy, and it was about sex education. I've always been a member of a book club, like since I was in my 20s. And for one of our book clubs, the book was a non-fiction book that touched on sex education. And we realised in the book club that even though we all grew up in the same state, we were all from the same generation, that we all had completely different sex ed experiences. I had two questions there. One, why was that the case? And two, what are the consequences of that? So I wrote a story about that. So I guess the other place that it comes from is books and book clubs. I also had this other story published in Q Weekend, which was about transgender teenagers. That inspiration was from listening to American news stories, also about transgender teenagers as well, which I found so fascinating. And I thought, well, there must be unique Australian stories that are also about that I haven't heard of yet. So often listening to international news, reading international stories and applying it to an Australian context is very, very good as well. This one, I had also heard a radio report about something called the Nude Olympics in Queensland, and it brought up the fact that nudity and nude beaches are still illegal in Queensland. There are no legal nude beaches. It's the only mainland state in Australia with no legal nude beaches. I thought that was hilarious and strange, and I wanted to dig into the history of the illegality of that. And so, of course, then I started hanging around with a lot of nudists. So, you know, radio stories, being keen consumers of the news, always, 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 there's a much bigger story to news stories. There's a bigger human story to news stories. So be a voracious and omnivorous consumer of daily news as well. And then finally, I guess one of the big places for ideas is just sheer curiosity. I remember when I was doing grocery shopping once, I saw a young kid who was in school uniform doing grocery shopping with their parent who was blind. And they just had such an interesting interaction because the child could obviously see all of the labels and their parent couldn't. But of course, the parent needs to police what's going in their trolley in other ways, like that's good for you, that's bad for you. And I thought that dynamic was interesting. And of course, I couldn't go up to those people and say, wow, what are your lives like? Tell me about the dynamic between you as a non-disabled child and a disabled parent. But what I could do was pitch that as a story. And then I started talking to parents with cerebral palsy, parents who were blind, parents who were deaf, who had hearing children and children without cerebral palsy, and what that dynamic was like. And that became a feature story for Q Weekend as well. So just sometimes rude curiosity, the stuff that you can't really ask in public, they can be the questions that you ask for feature stories as well. One other exercise that I often get people to do when it comes to generating ideas for magazines and websites is to one, identify which magazines and websites you really like and read on a regular basis. This would be a really good exercise for you to do as homework generally, to come up with that stock list, because if you are familiar with a magazine or a website already, that means that it will probably be much easier for you to pitch to them because you already know their in-house style. And secondly, you're already really passionate about the content they're making as well. From there, I'd also want you to identify 10 topics that you know really well, like inside out. And this might come from your professional background, or it might come from your educational background, but it might just come from your hobbies and interests. And this is a shame-free environment. So if you know all the ins and outs of, say, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is a very good show, you should be able to say that you're an expert in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The reason why I want you to identify your expertise is that you come with this bank of knowledge that a lot of other people, a lot of other contributors won't necessarily have. For that person before who is an Australian living in France, you'll be able to provide a very interesting perspective on French politics, French travel that other Australian writers won't necessarily give. So what are 10 topics you know really well? The other thing I'd want you to identify as well is what are 10 things that you know nothing about, but that perks your curiosity. Like, for instance, I know very little about Middle Eastern politics. I know very little about genetic science. I know very little about East Asian languages, but these are things that I would like to know more about. And why I want you to identify those things as well is that fuel of curiosity will be what drives you in writing the stories as well. So, like, just before, I had no background knowledge in the nudist community, for instance. I had no background knowledge in the nudist community, for instance, but I was very, very curious. So, of course, that was something that was always going to drive me through that story, just knowing that every situation I got in was going to be interesting or hilarious. And then what I do from there is start cross-pollinating as well. So which one of those magazines might take a story about your interest or your background expertise in Buffy the Vampire Slayer? If you know a lot about Israeli politics, how would that fit into Rolling Stone magazine, for instance, versus Good Weekend magazine versus Australian Women's Weekly. And in each of those magazines, you'll find a very different story is generated from that knowledge. If you have a lot of background knowledge about countryside France, for instance, that would be a very different story in a political magazine versus a travel magazine versus a women's interest magazine versus a weekend lift out. And you are applying that kind of same bank of knowledge to different publications to generate ideas, if that makes sense. So what I'd really encourage all of you to do is start harvesting all of those ideas in one place, whether it's on a Microsoft Word document, if it's in a journal. What you really need to do as a freelancer, especially if you want to be a professional freelancer, if you want to be earning a decent income off your freelancing, whether it's your sole income or your part-time income, is you need to be an ideas bank. Ideally, you're going to have so many ideas for magazines that you will never be able to write all of them. And that's kind of the point you need to get at anyway, because the sad thing about freelancing is that most of your story ideas will be rejected. Think of yourself, if you're a freelance writer, as an actor going for auditions. It's a maths game. You will not get most of the jobs that you audition for. Similarly, as a freelance writer, you will not get all of the story ideas you pitch up. So make sure you constantly have a big pool of ideas that you can keep going back to and you're constantly adding to as well. Okay, let's talk about pitching. So once you've got like a really good idea for a very specific magazine, what do you pitch to an editor and what does a pitch actually look like? So one thing I really want you to identify is why specifically this magazine or website. Okay, so I'm just going to answer a question here. I'll leave most of the questions to the end, but I think this is a good one to bring up here. Should you write the piece before you pitch or just have a list of ideas you're planning on writing? I would recommend that for most writers, especially if you're starting as a freelancer, is don't write the story completely. Think about it this way. If you were an editor and someone came up off the street and they said, I would like to write a story, you probably have some ideas of how to make that story good. What you'd really want is a very well-developed pitch, maybe some ideas of who they're going to interview as well. But you as an editor know your magazine inside out, so you probably have some things that you want to contribute. If you as a writer have already written 2,000 to 3,000 words on a topic, a really good draft, but with no guarantee that you're going to get it published, you could very well and probably are going to be wasting your time because an editor will want to have input. Say you're writing a really involved medical story. They might say, oh, actually, there's this really interesting doctor that you'd never heard of, but I've come across in my travels, and for this magazine, it'd be really good to talk to them for X, Y, and Z. They'll have all this kind of knowledge and insight that you won't necessarily have. So I always say pitch an idea, don't have a whole written story out there. Okay. Why specifically this magazine and website? Know that. So you need to know the difference between Frankie and Yen magazine. You really do need to know the difference between the Australian Women's Weekly and Women's Day. They are both very, very different magazines. For those of you who know, Australian Women's Weekly comes out on a monthly basis, which is odd, but you can't call a magazine Australian Women's Monthly. That's just gross. Whereas Women's Day is a weekly magazine, and that's kind of tabloid trash. That was the magazine that Rebel Wilson sued, whereas Australian Women's Weekly has had Walkley Award-winning contributors to it. So know your magazines and why you're specifically pitching to them. Basic things as well, like do you know the editor's name? Do address them. Don't address it as Dear Madam / Sir. One of the things that is your first test is you are going to propose that you can write a whole article and do all this research. Have you been able to do the specific courtesy of being able to research what the editor's name is? The editor's name will always be in the About section of a website or in the opening pages, the credits page of a magazine, and the latest version of the magazine as well. Make sure you get the latest version because the media changes and editors change as well. Another thing that I'd recommend is don't put all of your eggs in one basket. Don't just approach an editor and say, I really want to write this one story. And then you're waiting 1 week and you follow it up and it's like, I still want to write that story. Can you please get back to me? What I'd recommend is that you pitch 3 stories. If you can pitch 5, that's even better. If you can pitch 7, that's really, really great. Clint asked the question, how do you get those editors to respond if they don't know you when they're super busy and inundated with pitches? That's a very good question. Hopefully I'll answer that in the rest of the slides. So yes, why pitch 1 story when you can pitch 7? Also pitch to specific sections of the magazine and website and read its back issues inside out, which is to say you're not just pitching a story to Qantas magazine, you're pitching it to Qantas's blah section. So the first section of, say, Qantas magazine will have all those little fiddly bits. It might have a regular Q&A, and then it might have 3 different types of feature stories, and one might be called Insider, one might be Business Knowledge, another one might be called Secrets of On Foot, or whatever. I'm just making this stuff up. Pitch to those specific sections rather than the magazine as a whole, and it will help you with your pitches because you know the format of what you're writing about and what's come before it. Okay, what should you do with your first email? So that question before, like, how do you get an editor to pay attention with your first email? And I would always say that unless you've had prior contact with the editor, email first. Don't phone them because they might, and they probably will be, in the middle of something else. So always start with an email. Your introduction emails include where you've been published before. So hopefully by this stage you might have been published in a few different places. If you haven't been published before, you might want to still introduce yourself and tell them why you want to write for this magazine. But you might also want to include an on-spec sample of a story that would belong in a section of the magazine just to demonstrate your writing style. But, you know, the reason you'd say where you've been published before is because you're not going to be sending your CV as a whole to them. Basically writing things like, I've been published in this magazine, and this magazine. That's your resume. It's basically implying these other editors can vouch to me. Melinda asks, do you mean 7 stories to the same publication? Yes, I do, Melinda. What it shows to that editor is, 1, you are an ideas machine. And secondly, think about it this way. Most of your pitches, like I said before, are going to be rejected. And some of those pitches that might be rejected are the ideas that you think are best, that you've really got your heart set on. But I remember once I was pitching stories to an editor, and what I didn't know about that magazine was that they worked 6 to 9 months in advance. So when I thought I was pitching for their summer issues, because I was like, I'm working way in advance, they were already thinking about winter. And the story that I pitched was really, really good. They agreed, but they're like, we're not going to be able to run that for a really long time. But we like your other pitch, which would go in a smaller part of our magazine. Could you do that? And so that ended up being the commission instead. Sally asks, is it okay not to be an expert or professional in a field you write about? Yeah, totally, because your responsibility as a writer, as a journalist, is to be a good researcher as well. What else should you include? A concise, original, and intriguing pitch, and I'll show you what that might look like in a sec. All of your contact details obviously need to go into a pitch email. So make sure that you include your name, your number, your email address, and your website. And I know that sounds weird to include your email address in your email because you're sending it from your email. But if you have all of those things as a signature, most email programs nowadays can just right-click a signature and save all of those contact details to file as well. So just make it really easy on your editor. Notice how, like, I'm in this pitch email really spoon-feeding editors. They are busy people. So the more that you can help them get across who you are and have all your details on file, the better. The other thing as well is someone asked before about they're really, really busy people. So you can also request for their production schedule, which is to say you can simply ask, when is the best time in your production schedule to pitch. So if it's a weekly magazine, there'll be one day of the week where they're probably not going to read any pitches from strangers at all because they're rushing to production. But maybe Monday, after they've sent it off to the printer, or Tuesday is the day they've sent it off to the printer, maybe they'll tell you Wednesday is a really great day because we're all dry out of ideas, and this is when we want to hear more ideas. Just make sure, I mean, this sounds obvious, but make sure that your email is sent from a professional email address. You might have like a SpongeBob SquarePants _69 at Hotmail address that you're really wedded to, but a professional email address with your name in it, hopefully somewhere, is very, very important. Also, if you guys, this is a random thing, but if you guys are with like a Big Pond or an Optus account, maybe start a new account that you can travel with as well, because you might not always be with your internet service providers, and you want to make sure that the email address that your editors have on file are ones that you'll be able to take with you for the rest of your life as well. So, you know, a Gmail account or something similar would be good. A pitch. Okay, so a pitch I think should always just be a very, very decent paragraph. That's enough time for an editor to get their head around what you're talking about, and it doesn't waste your time as well because, as I said, most pitches get rejected. So list the section that you want to pitch to as well, whether it's like, you know, journeys by foot or travel bites, whatever it's called in a magazine. The subject matter of the story you're writing about. Write the pitch as a one-paragraph lead. You know how when you read a feature article, there's the headline, and then there's the story, and then there's that introduction paragraph between the headline and the story, where it's just like, few people know that in the hills of Bolivia, there is a family that is breeding dogs for blah, blah, blah. But how are they doing it and why? Imogen whoever investigates. Like, it's one of those kind of things. Like, you're tantalizing the audience, you're asking questions, and you've got them by tenterhooks as well. If you can write a pitch like that, arguably clickbaitish, but if you can write a tantalizing pitch as a one-par lead, that's a really, really great way of presenting it. Also, especially when you're pitching to an editor you've never contacted before, you want to refer back to previous stories in their magazine or website to which it's similar. That shows two things. One, that you read their publication and that you're familiar with it. And two, it immediately places them in a reference point that you've both got, so they can picture the story in their head much more easily. So you might say, look, this is very, very similar to, this would be similar to the story that you published in the summer issue about, you know, dogs with rabies, but this would be about cats with oral herpes. I don't know. That's a really terrible example, but you know what I mean. And then if you've got some URL links to further info that they might need, that would be really handy as well. So I'll just show you an example. This was a pitch that I think I sent years ago to a travel magazine called Travel and Leisure Southeast Asia. So it was for their travel journal section, where it's like a one day in a city kind of thing with an angle to it. And I was going to write about Melbourne as a literary hub. And I say Melbourne alongside Edinburgh and Iowa and Dublin has been recognised. So I'm just giving all this information, and see those underlined bits that I've got there, like World City of Literature, the Wheeler Centre. All I'm doing there is I'm highlighting that text, right-clicking it, and turning it into a URL. So if they are interested in what a World City of Literature is, they can find out. If they want to look at what the Wheeler Centre is, they can find out. Read more, here are a few links. And why I'm doing that is, look, if you are more interested in this pitch, you can delve into it in a deep dive. But if you aren't, it's only a paragraph and you can dismiss it quite quickly. I'm helping the editor know what the story is, but if they want to move on to the next thing, they can very, very easily. Sean asks, what do people include on their websites? Full articles or links to published pieces? Yeah, oh God, I haven't updated my website in a really long time, Sean, but yeah, I usually just include the full text, or if it's been laid out particularly well, I link it to the website, or I might even include a PDF. It's really how you want to present it, really. Usually by that stage, I would talk about how to write the story, but that's a whole other web seminar in a way. The craft of writing a story, how to interview people, how to research. So let's just skip ahead. You've gone from pitching these amazing ideas to an editor. Your editor has said, yes, that is fantastic. Go forth and write it, and here's how much I'll pay you. And we've skipped straight ahead to all of the horrors of actually writing a story and the pains and the ecstasies of it. You've filed it. You've gone through a very, very intense editing process that feels vaguely violating as well. But now it's done, and you can invoice them for it as well. One thing I want to say about money before we move on is that before you write a single word, I would encourage you to establish what you're actually getting paid for it. And a professional editor will tell you right from the outset, look, this is how much we can afford, or this is what our pay rate is. We pay by word, or we pay by story. And then you can say, yes, I want to write it, or no, I don't. Unfortunately, freelancers don't really have bargaining powers, so it's really up for you to say whether you want to accept that rate or not. Sometimes an amazing editor will say, what is your usual rate? And then you can lead them to the Australian Society of Authors rate sheets, or the MEAA, which is the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance rate sheets, which are very, very generous. And you can say to them, this is industry standard and pay me this. But really, why I'd say, to establish your pay rates before you write a word is you need to know whether you're getting paid or not. I think it's not rude at all to simply ask, am I getting paid for this? Can I clarify whether this is a paid gig or not? And if so, how much? And then you go from there. But do establish that before you write a single word. Okay, so invoicing. This is Cormac McCarthy, the American Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist. He says, I never had any doubts about my abilities. I knew I could write. I just had to figure out how to eat while doing this. I'm sure a lot of us can relate to that. What should an invoice include? I'll show you an example in a sec, but it's basically the word invoice or tax invoice. If you're registered for GST, you'd only be registered for GST if you're earning, I think it's $70,000 or over with this line of work, but maybe someone from accounting in the comments can tell me. But yeah, I think it's 70 grand or over. Most of us would be writing invoice until we get to a certain stage in our careers. Invoice number and date, to and from, the invoice number can simply be the number 1 for your first invoice. It's to this organization, attention to the commissioning editor, from me. Yes, Jessica, thank you very much. Joey, 70K per annum, 75 plus at the moment. Hannah, thank you very much, guys. I love good accounting nerds. Yes, so if you're earning $75,000 or over, that's when you need to be registered for GST, and then you'll be filing things like BAS and all that sort of stuff. Very, very boring, very exciting. Instructions for how to pay. So your bank details, account, BSB, and time demand. It's been a very, very long time since I've been paid by check, and bank deposits are just easier. Americans still like checks for some reason, but, we're in Australia, and this is just more efficient. So this is what an invoice might look like, the word tax invoice and all that sort of stuff. I just realized I showed you guys all my bank details, so I'm just going to skip to the next slide. Okay, so, so invoicing. Yes, just make sure that you get an ABN, or nearly 50% of your pay will be withheld. Get an accountant who understands the arts. Invoice ASAP, or you might never be paid. And confirm your rates before you work, or you're going to be caught off guard. There are some questions coming up about whether you should write for free or not. Look, I'm going to tell you what I did. So when I was 17 years old, I had some time outside of university where I said, I'm able to, I'd like to do some work experience. So I went to an editor and I said, I'd like to come in on Thursdays and give my time up for a while. And that's what I did. And eventually I got some paid work, and the paid work turned into more paid work, and that turned into bigger stories, blah, blah, blah. By that stage, I had a portfolio, felt confident enough to pitch to metropolitan newspapers. From there, I felt confident enough to pitch to glossy magazines, so on, so on, so on. If you're starting out in the industry and you feel tempted to, do an internship or to do some work experience, especially, essentially unpaid work, What I would say is there are unscrupulous people who will exploit that. And what I'd say is if you were going to do that, make sure, one, you know what you want to get out of it. And two, once you get what you wanted out of it, maybe it's 3 bylines, maybe it's an insight into how the industry works for several weeks. Once you get that, you leave. So you set those personal parameters up before you start. You discuss those parameters with the people who you're going to essentially provide free labor for, and then you get out once you're done, because exploitation is quite, common in this industry. So yes, tread carefully. Oh, and if you do start making a decent income from this, get business insurance if you can, because shit happens, especially public liability insurance. Yes, Turnip says, important to know what you want out of any situation. If you're just doing it because you'll be discovered, don't. Yes, a lot of people offer you to write for free for exposure. You might want those bylines, especially when you're starting out, but as a friend of mine once said, too much exposure and you'll die. Exposure to the elements. Okay, and the other thing, I know this is kind of boring, but it's sort of exciting as well, is know that as a writer, as an artist, technically under tax law, you can claim certain things as tax write-offs that other people from other industries can't. So these are some of them. And if your accountant doesn't know this stuff, you need to find a specialist arts accountant that does, because Australian tax law, God, this is really exciting now, isn't it? But Australian tax law does have caveats and special rulings specifically for artists that don't apply to other people. Just a few things before I start answering a lot of your amazing questions. Just time management. If you're trying to decide on a project, Laurie Anderson, the composer and sound artist, says for her it has to be 2 of the 3 following things. Has to be fun, has to be interesting, has to make money. Third one sounds crass, but when you're an artist, you do actually have to make a living. So, as a writer, as a freelance writer, a lot of gigs are going to come up that may pay well, but are neither interesting nor fun. You might want to think about turning that down, or if you really need the money, taking it up. But I think the important thing is to know why you're saying yes or no to things. Otherwise, it's very, very easy to get overwhelmed. Oh, this is time management, not invoicing. I've got the wrong header here. But just a few things about time management. I would advocate, if you really need to get into the zone, there are apps like Freedom and Forest that are really good at turning off your internet and phone use for specific hours that you need to knuckle down. Please, you need to honor every deadline. If you start missing deadlines, if you start building a reputation for that person that doesn't get your stuff over the line by deadline, editors talk, and you annoy them and they'll talk with each other. So plan way, way, way in advance. Finish your first draft before deadline so that you've got time to review it before you can confidently hit send. You need to schedule in admin time as well, because you're going to be your personal HR and finance department, and schedule your, leisure time, because it's not going to happen otherwise. And like Zadie Smith says, protect the time and space in which you write. Keep everyone away from it, even the people who are most important to you. If you have children you were taking care of in any way, shape or form, you need to tell them, these are just because I'm working from home doesn't mean that I can hang out with you right now. But communicate those parameters with the people in your life. And just also know that, if you find writing at the desk a painful exercise, that you are not alone, just like this chap here. Some of you can probably identify with this. I'm going to take some questions now. So I am going to start reading from the top. Yes, the line ends here. Thanks, Joey. Okay. Sean asks, I pitched an article to an editor who said he'd love to publish it, wrote the next day, sent it to him, didn't hear anything for a week, gave it to the HuffPost unpaid, as I thought it was better than seeing it elsewhere. So how do you deal with unresponsive editors? That's great. That's a great question. Look, if it's really, really time time dependent, like it's about a story in the news cycle, make sure the editor knows that up at the top, like urgent or time dependent story. If they don't answer, follow it up within a reasonable time. So if it's like a daily story, follow them up within the next 12 hours. Include in the first email perhaps a disclaimer saying, if I don't hear from you within the next 12 hours, I'll assume that you don't want the story, and we'll be happy to take it to someone else. Looking forward to dealing with you next time. Keep things just diplomatic, light and easy. If it's like a less regular publication, like a weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, whatever, I usually follow it up, a week afterwards, and keep it all on a thread so that they don't need to refer back to the last email that you sent. Just reply to yourself so they can see the context of your email. You're spoon feeding the editor. If they don't reply within another week, you might want to give them the second week and also say, if I don't hear back from you, I'll assume that you don't want it. I'll pitch to other outlets. I look forward to dealing with you in the future, blah, blah, blah. That editor might be really, really in a stressful position that week, and they might not be able to entertain story pitches. You don't know what's happening in the office. So I say always keep it open, because now that they know what stories you're interested in, they might say, oh, wow, like we need a story on bushfires. That person knows a lot about backburning or they've been in emergency services. I might get them to write, and they might actually contact you. Clint, how do you stop endlessly rewriting a piece and spending far more time than you're getting paid for? Yeah, Clint, that's a really, really good question. I usually write out like a chart. Like say I'm writing a 4,000 word story. I say week 1, I'm going to contact all of my interviewees and I'm going to lock them down and get them done within the week. Week 2 might be drafting. Week 3 is drafting and editing. And week 4 are final edits or something like that. Make sure that you know when you want things done by when, because you can't just, put in your iCal, write 4,000 word feature story every day. It doesn't work like that. You've got to take it step by step, and also make sure that you give yourself a reasonable amount of time to and a realistic amount of time to do those things as well, and follow that kind of micro schedule that you've broken down to a T if you can. Rena, a bit off topic, but do you have any advice about getting into technical writing? Yeah, I'm not too sure about that. I haven't done that much of it myself, but I'm sure that state writers' centres, like Australia is amazing because we've got so many state and territory-based writer centres. They would have a lot of information. So for those of you who would like to know more, I'd really encourage you to join, Queensland Writer Centre, New South Wales Writer Centre. There's one in ACT as well. They'll have a lot of those resources on hand. Emma asked, do you recommend following up email pitches by phone or email? I usually email, just because editors don't necessarily always want to feel put on the spot. So email is very good. Nicole, do you establish a kill fee? This is a difficult one, Nicole. Some magazines do have standard kill fees. The good ones will have a kill fee attached, but some magazines are smaller and independent, and you can't expect that from them. But if an editor, especially on a paper trail via email, has commissioned you to write something, you have that documented proof that they commissioned you. You've given them the piece that they agreed to, and now they're rejecting it. And I would start off by having a conversation with an editor if they've rejected it. Why? Because you have adhered to your agreement, and what happens next. But if you think that you've found yourself in an unfair situation, that's when an organisation like the MEAA can step in. And I've certainly used their legal advice before. So it's worth joining the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance if you think that you might get into spots of bother about that sort of stuff. Max asks what kind of contract you use, if at all. Look, it really depends on publisher to publisher. A lot of magazines don't even give you a contract at all. So it's really worth having a lot of that correspondence with editors via a paper trail just to show what you had agreed on. What else? What do people include on their websites? Oh, yes, we've had that already. I'm prepared to send my professional details, says Tess, but I want the stories published under a pseudonym. Have that conversation with your editor. If you want to publish under a different name for reasons of anonymity, discuss that with them with with why as well. And if the content warrants it, it's probably understandable, and they'll realize that. Okay, so what pitching techniques would a comic book pitch be similar to a magazine? Look, I imagine so, but again, that's not an area of expertise. I have Max, who asked that question. So I would get in touch again with my local state or territory writers organization and ask them that, because they'll have links to other graphic novelists and comic book writers and illustrators as well. Look, I'm going on a deep dive. I'll just answer a few more questions from below before I go right back up to the top. When pitching, blah, 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 blah. So when pitching to those sections, do you contact the editor or specific editors, writers who look after those sections? Asked Lisa. If there's a features editor and I'm pitching a feature story, I'll usually email the features editor and I'll CC in the deputy editor. If they're a robust enough workplace that they've got that many different section editors, you can usually count on the deputy editor doing a lot of the work, a lot of the grunt work, and that section editor taking care of that section as well. And that means that at least one of them has seen it. But if it's a smaller magazine, you usually just go straight to the editor. That's completely fine. Okay, I'm going to go right back to the top questions as well. Lisa, what are your thoughts on Medium? To be honest, Lisa, I've only read a lot of Medium stuff and I like it, but I haven't contributed to Medium, so I'm not really familiar with their pay structure, if they have any. But yeah, definitely worth asking others their experiences. And I guess this is what it's all about. It's a real knowledge sharing thing. So make sure that you belong to writers' groups. Make sure that you're friends with other writers. I know that sounds really lame and and needy, but this is such an isolating kind of industry that we're in, and it's an isolating job to write. You need to be able to compare notes with other writers. Who are the good editors? What constitutes an unreasonable situation as well? Ella says, starting out from zero, having not been published anywhere before, do you think focus on pitching to a couple of publications or spread the net wide? Where to start? Regional, smaller magazines? Ella, it depends on what kind of writer you are. If you feel confident that you can write something big for a big glossy magazine, go for it. But at the same time, if you don't have any notches on your belt, they'll need some sort of demonstration that you can write. That's why I said before, maybe giving them an on-spec piece for a smaller section of their magazine might be good, because essentially what you're doing every time you pitch to a new editor is that you are coming off the street as a stranger and saying, can you give us a job? But they don't really know who you are. And so you need to console and reassure them that you can do the work, and that might be with a bit of on-spec writing. So yeah, pitch to magazines that you feel that you're at the level where you can write for them as well. Okay, a lot of questions coming in, and I apologize in advance that I won't be able to answer them all. Jessica, thank you for the kind words about my column. Are there many opportunities for writers to get a column? Yeah, look, that kind of came up because an editor asked me to write a column, and that's usually how columns start. I think it's very rare, unless you're in a newsroom, to say, I want to write a column, and this is what it's going to be about. But because I had pre-existing relationships with editors and they knew the kind of style in which I could write, that started becoming a thing. And also I'd kind of built a following from Frankie magazine, and so they knew that they could take an audience with them to their magazine in a way. So yeah, columns are kind of a less structured thing and a more organic thing in terms of how they become established. Jesse has a really great question. Have I always pitched only to Australian magazines? That's a really great question, because I would encourage you all to pitch to overseas magazines. In a way, you're all very lucky that you write in English, because English language magazines and websites have such huge markets overseas, and we've got so many more opportunities outside of Australia. You can get paid in euros, pounds, and US dollars if you pitch overseas. And the fact that you're an Australian writer, makes you a bit of a novelty to a lot of overseas editors as well. They're very, very interested about what's going on here. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine, he wrote a story about water conservation in Australia, and it took him a lot of time to write. And the Australian magazine that he was commissioned to write it for, they couldn't run the story in the end, and they gave him a kill fee, but he was absolutely heartbroken by it. But then he realized, actually, the Australian story that he had written about water conservation applied to so many other countries in the world that were struggling with their water infrastructure. So he pitched it all around the world, and it became his most successful story ever because he was paid in so many different currencies. It got reprinted in so many different languages because Australia at that stage was quite an extreme example of what other countries were already facing or about to face as well. So Australia, we might be located on the asshole of the world, arguably, but we are a very, very kind of fascinating piece of exotica to a lot of overseas audiences. So use that to your advantage. Louise asked, do I have any suggestions for finding fresh angle on topics that have been written about before? Yeah, maybe look, that kind of pairing exercise that we did earlier about what magazine does it belong to? One of the exercises I really like is to get a topic and think about the least likely magazine it would be published. So, for instance, same-sex marriage is a hot button issue in Australia at the moment for obvious reasons. Where are the most obvious places that it would get published? It would get published in, queer publications, general readership magazines like Good Weekend or The Weekend Australian. But, how fascinating would it be for a kids magazine to publish something about same-sex marriage, profiling a child with same-sex parents? I remember that might sound outlandish, but one of the most interesting pieces I saw in same-sex couples and rainbow families was in Dolly magazine, where it was, looking at a young teenage girl and her same-sex parents, and trusting the reader that they'd be able to understand the story from that perspective as well. Lisa says that I'm a travel photographer, tend to pitch stories based on images I've got available and relating stories. Are images an important element for an editor? They're more concerned about the story because they can source images anywhere. It's a really good question, Lisa. What I've found is that for most publications, they're just interested in the story because photography is a very, very specialist discipline and not everyone's good at it, obviously. They'll want photographs taken by their freelance photographers or their in-house photographers. That said, the only caveat to that is travel magazines. Often travel magazines prefer or actively want you to go out there and give them both the story and the photos together, especially if you're writing about places that are obscure, if you're writing about travel destinations that are less likely to be photographed. I mean, hotels and stuff will have their own PR departments with their own quality photos that the magazine might be able to publish. But if you are specifically a travel writer and you are also a very good photographer, travel magazines will love that. But most other magazines don't really need that. Jeff asks, what balance do I advise for online and print pitching? Look, it really depends on your interest in the print space and the digital space and what each of them offers you financially as well. So it's really up to your personal tastes and circumstances. Okay, Sally, can I pitch to an editor or production? Editor productions rather than publications. Playwright so far only once published before many productions though. Look, Sally, your background as a playwright can provide you in good stead because it's not an editor that's vouching for you, but the fact that a production house or a theatre company has put you on, it might be attractive to certain editors as well, and especially arts publications and lift outs. Leah, how is invoicing different for overseas publications? It's not really, actually. I mean, those things about GST and tax don't apply because they're not in the Australian tax system. It's really mostly about getting the money to you. So in the instructions of the invoice, where it's like, please pay me via this BSB and account, You'd be providing all of your Australian bank account details, but with the SWIFT code instead. Every bank will have a SWIFT code. If you don't know it, Google it or ask your bank what it is. And with your SWIFT code, bank account details, and maybe the BSB as well, but I'll have to look that up. You'll be able to get a direct transfer into that account. Other people start PayPal accounts specifically to make the transaction process easier between overseas bank accounts and Australian ones as well. So you might want to start a PayPal account as well, although there may be fees involved. So check that out. Dan, how similar, dissimilar is pitching process for film and TV writing? Yeah, it's really, really different, Dan, because TV and film is a much bigger and more complicated and financially intensive industry as well. So, and the pitching happens on all levels. So you might be pitching something to get representation with an agent, or you and your agent, or you directly might be pitching something to a production company, but then that production company is going to have to pitch to broadcasters and to funding bodies to get it funded. So there's so many more levels of what pitching actually involves. Jen, do you recommend a mentor? Look, I've had many mentors in my life, university lecturers. I had an official mentor at one stage through a mentorship program that a state funding body was running, but I'm not sure if that's happening anymore. I think Australia Council for the Arts still has an official mentorship program for young artists. So look into that. If it's still up, it's called something like Spark or something like that, or YAMP, some strange acronym. But yeah, look up Australia Council mentorship programs, and mentors can come up. And those programs are really valuable in that they pay both you and the mentor money to do something like that. Okay. What should you do if an editor steals your idea? Look, two things here. One, sometimes an idea is actually out there in the world. I remember with Frankie magazine, I pitched a story to Frankie about, what are the best podcasts out there at the moment? Because podcasts were still a really new thing at that stage. That shows how old I and the magazine am/are. And we wrote the story, here are like 10 podcasts you should be listening to. A contributor wrote to Frankie and they got really, really furious at them, saying, I pitched you this podcast listing idea 1 month ago. But, by that stage, I think we had 10 pitches about podcasts because podcasts were getting so big. So it really depends on the idea. But if it's such a specific idea that it would have been very, very hard for them to source that idea from anywhere else except by copying it from you. I would maybe seek the MEAA's advice about that, have that paper trail as well, and get some robust legal advice about what your rights are there. If you have committed it to paper trail, that's why I really recommend having those conversations via email. That's very important. Journalism degrees, yay or nay, from Sean. Sean, I don't have a journalism degree, but I don't really think of myself as a journalist anyway. But what I did do was a creative writing degree, and I had a lot of journalism subjects in that. Look, a journalism degree, any sort of arts degree, doesn't guarantee you a career in the media or arts. I hope I'm not pointing out the obvious there. What it does provide you are basic core skills, and it provides you a sense of community, and it may provide you mentors as well. And those things are really, really invaluable. So if you're looking for those things, then maybe pursue a degree. But if you're looking for guaranteed work, that doesn't necessarily come from a professional qualification. I look back at my writing career and, it was a combination of the skills that I picked up at university combined with a work experience that I did outside of university, combined with the fact that I was a student magazine editor, combined with the fact that I was writing on the side freelance. All those things combined, all of those things were important. Were any one of those things essential on its own? Not just on its own, they all kind of complemented each other. Few more questions. Look, we are approaching 9 o'clock, so we'll probably have to wrap up soon. Apologies, guys. How do you move from short features to long form? I I don't know, Melinda. I think you just kind of do. Sorry, just realized this is very impersonal because you're just seeing a slide instead of my face. So maybe I'll just still here. Yeah, so moving from short form to long form, it's about whether you are confident enough with your research skills. So a 4,000 word piece will require a lot of interviews, a lot of reading, and a lot of that time put in. If you feel like you've started building up those muscles and you have completed your 400-meter run and you're ready for the 1, 2, 3 kilometer dash, then go for it. I'm not sure there's any secret besides, you identifying that you as a rider are ready. I hope that makes sense. Oh, thanks for the kind words, those lovely people. And Joey, yes, don't ever say sorry. Unless you've done something wrong, then you should apologize. Emma asks, a PhD worth doing? Can I give you a secret, Emma? Mainly did it for the scholarship, poor writer. But yeah, no, it was worth doing because I did it in TV writing and that helped me be a TV writer later. So it's really about whether you want to be an academic or what you want to get out of the PhD, really. Have I missed any questions? Cass, you'd prefer to look at those shelves. Yeah, they're pretty messy, but not particularly tidy. What else? Look, have I missed anything? Look, if I have missed anything, start to forward this. Yeah, so if you've missed the start or want to forward this to friends, like Jeff says, you'll be sent a replay tomorrow. Also, the other thing that you might want to consider as well is that Writer's Block, who have set this brilliant thing up, they've got this thing called Boost, where I think you contribute $5 and you'll be privy to newsletter information full of industry links and opportunities as well. So Writer's Block is playing a very invaluable service to them as well. So if you want to support them in that way, you'll be supported tenfold back with opportunities. But basically everything out there, every publication, every website out there that takes English language works is an opportunity. So seek them out. Sign up to your local writer centers. All of them have magazines that tell you about writing opportunities. My first book deal that came out of the fact that I wrote for an anthology that I read about from a writing magazine as well. So you never really know where the bigger opportunities will come from. And of course, the book snowballed into a TV show. So yeah, be on the lookout constantly for ways that you can get your work done. Anyway, I hope that answers your questions. I hope that helps. I know that it's been a blitz, but thank you for joining me, all you wonderful nerds on a Wednesday evening as well. Happy writing and stay in touch. I'm not sure if Jeff needs to come back to say anything, but yeah, look, thank you. You're all very, very kind. I'm reading your thanks and various Japanese emojis as well. So I really, really appreciate it. Joey, I've said your name 4 times tonight. That's a 5th time. Joey, that's a 6th time. I hope that does something for you. Thanks, guys. Thank you very much. Have a good night. Happy writing. Stay safe.